Hey guys, welcome to our next lesson. So this one's going to be on new immigration to the United States, and we're going to be focusing on the millions of new immigrants who were coming to the United States between the years 1880 and the 1920s, as well as taking a look at what they encountered when they arrived in places like New York City, Boston, Chicago, and we're also going to look at the rise of other urban areas in the United States. So let's get started. So, before we talk about new immigration, you really need to understand what old immigration was. Well, old immigration would fall in the time period from 1776 till about the Civil War, the 1860s. And most of these immigrants came from Western and Northern Europe, countries like England, Scotland, Ireland, and even Germany. And many of them spoke English. Even some of the Germans who came over could speak at least a little bit of English. And most of them were skilled workers, laborers with some level of education. Many of them were Protestant Christians, so they were Anglican, they were Baptist, they were Methodists, they were Presbyterian. And the one exception were the Irish, who were largely Catholic. But overall, the cultures they came from easily integrated within the United States. The political system, a lot of what people read, the language people spoke, the music, a lot of political and religious beliefs were already in the United States, so it was easy to kind of fit in and find other people who you could agree with, even if you came from a different country. And here is a breakdown that shows you exactly where people lived and where they came from. So you can kind of check out this pie chart up here. You can find uh, um, where these old immigrants were settling, right? So let's take a look at the new immigrants now. So new immigrants or new immigration is during the time period from the 1870s to the 1920s. And we're going to see a big change in where immigrants are coming from to the United States and the effect they're having on the United States. And they differed from the old immigrants in that they came mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe instead of Western and Northern Europe. So now they're coming from places like Italy, Russia, Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we're talking about millions. About 20 million in total came from all of these countries. And there are also a lot of people coming from Asia. There are a lot of about 500,000 total who came from places like China, Japan, and Korea, and a lot of them settled on the West Coast. Also, from Mexico and the Caribbean, there are about 1 million immigrants to the United States during this time. And all of these people spoke languages, and some of them were very different from English, especially Asian languages are very different. We have an alphabet, right? And they have a character system, very different pronunciations and expressions. So it made it very difficult for a lot of them to make that adjustment. Um, a lot of them are also unskilled laborers who didn't have much education. They were coming to the United States because they wanted new opportunities. They wanted a chance to survive because they weren't doing well in their home countries. And many of them weren't doing well because they didn't have access to education. Many of them were also Catholic, and many of them were Jewish, those coming from Russia, those coming from Eastern Europe, and a big chunk of them were Jewish, and they were escaping religious persecution. And a lot of folks who came from Italy were Catholic. Italy is, after all, where the Vatican is, where the Pope lives, right? And for those coming from Asia, many of them were Buddhists, which in the United States was a very rare religion to find. And these cultures didn't all adapt as easily in the United States. It wasn't as easy to find other people who were already in the United States who shared these beliefs, who spoke these languages. So it made it a much more difficult adjustment to life here for these new immigrants. And here's a pie chart you can look at, and it basically breaks down immigration to the United States and where people were coming from. So you can see the majority of immigrants, 56%, were still coming from Northern and Central Europe. But you see these increased numbers of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, coming from the Americas, so Central and South America, coming from Asia as well. And only a small percentage coming from Africa and Oceania, which would be like Australia and New Zealand. So why were they coming? Why were these immigrants coming? Well, I've already mentioned a few um, reasons. There are many reasons, right, um, that they came here, and we like to categorize these diverse regions as either push or pull factors. And this is important to remember and take note of. So, first of all, push factors were conditions that cause people to leave their homelands and migrate to another region, right? So, it was the reasons that pushed them out and caused them to leave their homeland. And so, for example, overpopulation in places like Europe and even China meant that there was less land for people to live on and less resources. So they came to the United States because they believed, and to some extent they were able to, find more land. There was also religious persecution, like I mentioned earlier. The Jewish population in Russia, in particular, was targeted by the government of Russia, something we call the pogroms, which you should have learned about in world history, and which meant that they needed to flee, where otherwise they could be killed by their government. There's also political persecution. People who were critical against of their governments, they were being attacked by their government. People were escaping war and political upheaval that was happening in Europe. So those were some of those push factors that caused them to leave their homeland. And then we have something called pull factors. Pull factors are those conditions that encourage people to come to a particular place. The reason for them choosing to come here. So, for example, people also wanted to come into the United States because they knew that they could find jobs. They knew industry was blowing up here, so they knew they could find jobs and factories. They also knew there were a lot of farmlands. So some of them, they hoped to find their own farms in the United States. And there's also just a desire for independence in the United States. With our Bill of Rights, you have freedom of religion, freedom of speech. A lot of other countries didn't have these rights guaranteed for their citizens. And so these immigrants wanted to experience those rights in the United States. So when they arrived here, many of them, it took them weeks for them to get here. They traveled by steamship. The use of steam was a major invention of the Industrial Revolution, and it helped to increase travel and transportation time quickly rather than relying on the wind. But still, even with that invention, it still took weeks for them to get here. And these steamships were crowded and unsanitary. When they got to the United States, they would have to enter through immigration stations like Ellis Island in New York, which today is now a museum. And Ellis Island, they saw almost over 17 million people who entered the United States during this time. And on the West Coast, you had Angel Island, which you can travel to and visit in San Francisco, California. They saw about 50,000 people enter from Asia and the Pacific Islands. When they got here, they would all get off the boat, the steamship, and they faced a physical examination. They faced legal questioning, and their fate was always uncertain. You could even be detained. You could be detained for any reason for days. It was even possible for you to be sent back to be put back in the boat and sent back to where you came from if you didn't pass these tests, if you didn't pass the physical exam. So here is an image of what Ellis Island looked like on the inside when it was used as an immigration station. Take note of, look at the lines of people who are just waiting to go through the process. Ellis Island does still exist up in New York, right? And it's now a national park museum. And here's a photo I took when I went to New York in 2018. And this is exactly what immigrants arriving to Ellis Island would have seen as they entered New York Harbor. They'd see the Statue of Liberty as you see in this photo. And here is a photo of the entrance to the Ellis Island Museum, which is definitely a place you need to visit for yourself someday. If you ever get a chance to visit New York, I definitely recommend going to check it out. It was pretty cold. I went in January. There you can see there's snow on the ground. And here is a photo that I took inside of Ellis Island, the same room that I showed you in the black and white photo just a few seconds ago. It's really crazy to think about just how many people to this day living in the United States, their descendants, right? That their family member, their ancestor walked through this exact same room that I was standing in to start a new life here in America. And here's a photo of folks going through the physical exam, which would only last a matter of seconds. But again, if you were ill or if something just looked wrong with you, you could be sent back to where you came from. So, if they made it through these immigration stations, what was life like when they actually came into the United States? Well, immigrants formed tight knit communities for support as they adjusted to life in their new home here. Old immigrants would help new immigrants to find work. They would help them find a place to live. They would share their food. They would celebrate their culture together. I mean, it's always good when you're seeing people who share a common language and share common beliefs and things. Um, it's great to share those ideas with folks. And once there are enough of them here, they would open community centers. They would open places of worship, churches, and synagogues. They would publish newspapers written in their home language. They would open orphanages for kids who came from those countries who didn't have parents or lost their parents. They even had cemeteries together so they can memorialize those who passed from their culture and from their country. And they would work to maintain language and culture while adapting to new life here. This would lead to conflicts, though, with, for example, native born or more mainstream Americans. And we'll talk about that in just a bit, in a few slides. But to give an idea of what life would have looked like here. Here on the left is a photo from New York City back during this time period. And really notice how crowded it is. And if you look more closely, you can see, if you had the original photo and you were able to zoom in, you'd be able to see a wide array of languages on some of the store cloths. Languages from Hebrew to Italian to Russian to Polish and some other Eastern European languages. So, like I said, when the immigrants arrived here, not everybody welcomed them. And there was this rise of something called nativism. And nativism was made up of people who were called nativists. And nativists despised these new immigrants. They did not like them. They believed that Anglo-Saxon immigrants, those English and German immigrants, were superior, that they had superior culture, superior language, and religion. And these nativists feared that these different religions that were coming into the country and these different religious beliefs and cultures, particularly of the Catholics and the Jews, would hurt American democracy and religion. And they also had a fear of white Americans losing jobs to immigrants. And they wanted to segregate schools. They wanted segregated schools and public services. They thought that by desegregating, by allowing these different cultures to come into the schools and get an education and work, that it would hurt, they believed it would hurt American society and hurt American government. And here on the left is a political cartoon that shows nativist beliefs in California, here in California. You can see an election was coming up. There's a vote that was coming where the folks in California were trying to kick out these Chinese. And this one party, known as the Working Men's Party of California, as you can see in this image, the Working Men's Party, or the WPC, is on the leg on the right and is trying to kick out a derogatory image of a Chinese person. Immigrants would also see signs like these, where you can go in for work and they would say, hey, help wanted. But if you're Irish, if you're Jewish, if you're Chinese, don't bother applying. You could discriminate back then against people and not really have to worry about the repercussions. So you can see this nativist mentality displayed in this sign here. And there are actually laws against immigration too. For instance, in 1882, the United States passed what was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this basically, it severely restricted immigration from China. In fact, the number of immigrants to the United States from China drastically fell. And this law was on the books until 1943, until World War II. And in 1907 and 1908, the United States made an agreement with Japan, where Japan agreed to limit the number of Japanese who were leaving the country to enter the United States. And then in 1917, it became law that immigrants entering the United States had to take a literacy test. And then in the 1920s, legal quotas were passed. And what this meant was that there are restrictions on immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The quota was a certain number that could be allowed into the country, and those numbers were pretty low. And once that number had been met, no more people from that country would be allowed in for that year. And immigration from Western and Northern Europe, though, was still encouraged. So it's just immigration from places in Eastern Europe, from Asia, that were discriminated against, and not from places like England or Scotland or Germany. And here is on the left a political cartoon, and it sums up the views of these times that many Americans had, or at least enough people in the government and society had to support the creation of these laws. And you can see where Uncle Sam is standing at the door, at the gate, and he's rejecting or blocking entry to this immigrant. So immigrants came to the United States at a time when cities were exploding in the United States. This was something known as urbanization, the growth of cities. Most of the immigrants who came to the United States actually stayed in the cities. And you might wonder why. Why? Why did they come to cities? Well, cities were cheaper, and there were plenty of jobs for unskilled laborers at a lot of these factories that were located in the cities. In fact, in 1890, there are 2 times as many Irish living in New York City as there were in Dublin, which was the largest city in Ireland. So you had this kind of conflict between Americanization versus traditionalism. And what this means is that governments and citizen groups wanted to start programs to assimilate immigrants, to help them blend into the United States. So you had places like settlement houses that would provide assistance in the poorest neighborhoods. For example, one famous place was Hull House in Chicago. Hull House. And it was founded in Chicago by a woman named Jane Addams. And what they would do was they would provide daycare. They'd provide classes to these immigrants, classes in English, home economic skills. They would provide medical care for people. Many of these people had never even seen a doctor and certainly couldn't afford seeing a doctor, right? And immigrants would also form their own social groups in order to maintain their culture. And they would often live in communities by ethnicity. For example, in New York, you had places like Little Italy. In New York City, out in LA, you had places like Chinatown, as well as in Washington, D.C., you had Chinatown. And those names came from neighborhoods where you had a lot of people from a certain ethnic group living in that community, right? So you can see it's this conflict between assimilating through these settlement houses like Hull House, and then you also had the immigrants groups trying to form communities where they were able to preserve their culture, their ethnicity, by living in close proximity with one another. And you also had political groups known as political machines who would also help immigrants in exchange for votes. So these political groups might help immigrants find a job, for example, and a place to stay. And in return, they would expect the immigrants to vote for their candidates, right? So it was a little bit of manipulation. So check out this map in 1910. It shows you in each state of the United States where the largest immigrant group came from in that state. So if you notice, for example, for Washington, D.C., it looks like it's a cross between Germany and the UK, the United Kingdom, where Great Britain and Scotland are. But notice for West Virginia, which is really close to D.C., it's right over here, West Virginia, that Italy actually had the largest number of immigrants living in that state. And then you'll notice in the Southwest, you had Mexico. Mexico had a large mix of states. But then look up in New York, for example, New York City. Notice that Russia and what would later be the USSR had sent the most number of immigrants there. And then here in California, where we live, Germany, during this time period, the highest number of immigrants coming from another country, the highest number came from Germany and settled in California in 1910. So life in the city had plenty of problems. And in fact, it wasn't just immigrants who were moving to the cities. It was many people leaving the countryside for the cities too. And African Americans were also leaving the South and moving to the cities. And large numbers, in fact, between 1890 and 1910, over 200,000 African Americans left the South and moved to the cities. For many of the same reasons that immigrants were coming to the United States. They wanted to find work, and they also wanted to escape violence and oppression from the local governments and local culture of the South. For African Americans, it was in particular racial violence, and they wanted to escape Jim Crow laws, for example. And many of these new settlers in the city settled in what were known as tenements. And these were multifamily urban dwellings, often very overcrowded and often very unsanitary. You'd have single family apartments that would house several families, right? So it's meant for one family, but you have multiple families living there. You'd be very cramped. And this meant that there was little access to sunlight, little access to fresh air, little access to clean water. And this would result in lots of garbage, and there would be an increase in crime and fires. Fires were also a big concern because a lot of these early cities were built out of wood. Um, so there were massive fires. For example, in Chicago in 1871, there was another massive fire in San Francisco in 1906. Baltimore had a fire in 1902, which destroyed good portions of the city. And here on the left is an image of what some of the tenements would have looked like on the outside. So take notice that folks they're hanging out their laundry to dry in between the buildings, right? And then here is an image of what it would have looked like inside one of these tenement buildings. Notice how many people are in the photo. You got a very large family, and you don't really see any windows going outside. So it would have been very, very dark on the inside of these tenements, right? And notice this. This is, talking about sanitation and garbage problems. Here, you've literally got a few kids hanging out in the street with a dead horse that's just hanging out there. And you see, if a dead horse is just allowed to stay out there on the street, imagine what else there would be in the city streets. Imagine how else how unsanitary the streets would have been if this is something that you could just see walking down the street. So cities were undergoing massive revolution during this time. When you go to a city, you'd see amazing new things like skyscrapers. Skyscrapers were constructed because, land was limited in places like New York, which, is an island. So people thought, why not just build up into the sky? And skyscrapers were also possible because during this time steel had come along, because steel was very strong and flexible, right? And you also had the invention of elevators, which allowed people to access high-story buildings, like you see here in this photo, which I took of. That's the Empire State Building when I went to New York. And many skyscrapers were built during this period. Using new technology from industrialization, right? And part of the reason was there wasn't a lot of land in these cities available, so they needed to build upwards, right? You also had mass electric transit, like the predecessors to the subway, right? And rail cars and things like that. And this allowed people to travel great distances within the cities. Streetcars in cities like San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., subways in Boston and New York, L trains or elevated trains in places like Chicago. These would all allow for people to spread out, but also get from point A to point B in the cities very quickly. And this would lead to the growth of the suburbs. People they were able to move out just outside of the city, right, and still get to work in the cities on time and very easily with mass electric transit available. And you had people in the cities who would deliberately plan the cities, right? So that they weren't too crazy, right? So they would actually they'd like plan them out. They wouldn't just randomly spring up out of nowhere. It wasn't so random. So their job was they'd build things like large bridges to connect cities that are divided by rivers, such as places like New York, Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, even Washington, D.C. because you had folks who were coming, let's say, out of Virginia, and they needed to cross bridges to get into Washington, D.C. to go to work. And these city planners also planned parks and zoos, recreational facilities for people to go outside and enjoy and be able to relax. And places like Central Park in New York City, the Emerald Necklace in Boston is another one, the White City in Chicago. In Washington, D.C., we have the National Mall and Meridian Hill Park and lots of other parks. And these urban planners also built things like sewers and sanitation systems to deal with an increasing amount of garbage. They also introduced police and fire departments, organized police and uh, fire departments to help combat crime, and also to limit the risk of fire destroying cities. And speaking of mass transit, here's a streetcar from back in the day. So take a look at what it says and see, can you figure out what street it might be running on and what neighborhoods it would be passing through? Um, and then check out this photo. This is an aerial photo of Central Park in New York City. And notice how, we have all that green space, right? And walkways that are surrounded by these really tall skyscrapers and buildings. So parks became something that needed to be planned out, right? So what drew people to the city, right? Well, there are a lot of things that you could do there. People had more money during this time and they wanted fun things to spend it on. Things like paper products. You could buy a lot of books and newspapers, magazines. Those were all in the very popular. Um, People go to all sorts of museums. They could go to libraries and check out books for free. They could go to music, see music played live, parks, and go to parks and ride rides near as well, and they can get cotton candy. People also became interested in recreational and spectator sports because they had more leisure time. And people also got into bicycling, tennis, baseball, boxing. Um, all that ended up taking off. Um, Department stores were these massive stores where you could go and see everything you could possibly want and more. And these department stores would reach out to people also in rural areas by mailing them mail catalogs where people could flip through them and order basically whatever goods they saw and have them delivered to their homes. It's kind of like an earlier version of like buying things off the internet, right? And here is the inside of New York Public Library, which was the first New York Public Library. And you can just check out the beautiful room where you could go and get a book and just sit there and read or stare at the ceiling. When I went, this room was obviously packed with a bunch of people, but it was really, really cool. The architecture and just everything about it was really, 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 really cool to see. And this is an example of a page you would see in a mail order catalog. Really look at the fashion of the day. See if that's like, maybe anything you might want to wear. I doubt it, but that's basically, this is something that, for example, that somebody back then they would see for themselves when they open up a mail catalog, right? And here is one of the first, one of the first big and really successful department stores was Macy's. It's the same Macy's that hosts the Thanksgiving Day Parade every year. And this is an image of their building when it first opened back in the 1800s in New York City. And there was also a big emphasis on public education during this time, with all these people moving into the cities and even people in the towns and the countryside. Uh, you know, states began passing laws that required education for children ages 8 to 14. And they also passed laws that established tax supported public schools, since you had all these new people moving in. We even had the emergence of kindergartens for younger children. They became very popular. And then high schools would be very different. But we had a lot of high schools being built uh, and started. And even though they were different, they're pretty different from the ones you had to attend today. They focused more on vocational classes, basically teaching students job skills. There were classes for girls and that would focus on home economics, like cooking and sewing and tending a home. And then, however, you even had with this increase in interest in public education, access to such education. Um, it really was limited, still very severely limited for African Americans, unfortunately. In fact, in 1910, only 3% of African American children attended school, but most of them only attended private schools. Immigrants, they would attend in large numbers when they came to the United States. Catholics who came to the United States, for example, would establish a large number of parochial or religious schools so that their students would receive a Catholic centered education. And as you can see in this photo, some African American students in class, and this is something that was unfortunately pretty rare back then, but it still did happen. They did have access, some of them, to education. Now, let's take a look at higher education, so colleges and universities during this time. And it's important to note that during this time, the 40-year span from 1880 to 1920, college enrollment in the United States more than quadrupled. So 4 times as many people enrolled in college during this time compared to previous decades. And part of this was because colleges were modernizing their curriculum. So they offered courses in modern languages, in physical sciences, in law, medicine, and more contemporary subjects. Universities were also founded specifically for African Americans. A lot of the HBCUs, as we call them today, schools like Lincoln, Howard, Atlanta University, and Fisk, they were among some of the first universities founded specifically for African Americans. In 1900, there were only 3,880 out of 9 million African Americans who were enrolled. So it was still a very, very, very small number who were in college. But you did have folks like Booker T. Washington who were pushing for African Americans to educate themselves. Booker T. Washington, he advocated for African Americans to focus on improving in their vocational skills to empower their economic strength in the United States. Meanwhile, you had educators like W.E.B. Du Bois, who pushed for a liberal arts education for African Americans so that they could be strong citizens and participate in civil society more easily and be considered equals of all Americans, particularly white Americans. And here is an image, a photo of Booker T. Washington, right? So he was the one who pushed for vocational schooling and helping them to improve their skills and focus on their skills that would allow them to get a job, right? And here's an image of W.E.B. Du Bois. And he, while they had their differences over what African Americans should be focusing on, right? So he focused on a liberal arts education so that they could be more strong citizens, right? And more be able to participate in civil society. So he was a little bit different than Booker T. Washington, what he emphasized. But nevertheless, both of them, they supported the African American community and would have certainly agreed that African Americans should have access to an education. And here's a photo from a chemistry classroom at Howard University, which again was one of the first universities established and founded to specifically educate African Americans in the United States. And here is a photo. It's an image of the choir from Fisk University, which I believe it's in Tennessee. And a lot of these HBCUs would earn money for their schools with their gospel choirs, like you see here in this photo. And they would tour the United States and tour the world to great acclaim. A lot of people really enjoyed their talent. So thank you for checking out this video. I hope you learned something from it. So let me know if you have any questions. So please email me or let me know in class if you need help with anything. And thank you so much.